Happy New Year. It's 2023. Not when we're recording this, but it is when you're watching this. And we're joined by none other than Gottmoxi and Dor, our experts for the final wrap up of Contenders Month to come and usher in our hopefully new European overlords. How are the both of you doing?
I'm
Good.
doing hot. Yeah. This is gonna be a lot of fun. Look, there's a lot of hopium going around, but there's also plenty of copium to balance it out. So I think we got plenty to talk about.
Good. Moxie, how are you?
I'm doing good. You know, all of the lineups just pretty much got announced at the moment. So all of my notes and all of my plans and my mental
Irrelevant.
mind maps of this player to this team and this player to this team, my Final Fantasy football rosters have unfortunately been entirely put on asunder. But you know what? It's Rostermania. What's
It's true.
Rostermania all about in terms of capsizing your expectations?
I mean, it's capsizing expectations, but there's also, there's some teams still left in the wings that,
True.
We'll see. We'll see what they do. Yiska, have you stopped playing Hunt Showdown yet?
No, actually, I'm constantly feeding my brains out every night. I'm currently on vacation. But yeah, no, I think it's also the case that, the off season is presumably a little bit longer. There's still slots to be filled. Once these teams start scoring, maybe, the budget usually loosens up a little bit if you see a bargaining deal somewhere. There's still some open slots, I suppose, where the rosters weren't leaked or weren't locked in. Let's say that. So there's certainly some opportunities. I will also say it's like sometimes knowing a little bit more how the cake is made is like those GMs aren't as incompetent as you think they are and are under constrictions that are pretty severe in terms of like who the talent is that's picked. And well, it would be amazing to live in a world where everyone is just like picked in the correct order of their ability, regardless of their physical location right now. That's unfortunately not the case. And there's probably no region that suffers more from this or will suffer more from this than the European region, unfortunately.
It's like them in China, right?
I could feel the pain in Yiska's voice.
Yes.
I felt it. Like that hurt me.
Yeah.
It's sad because there's so many like
is.
talented players that's just like, yeah, well, if only visas were cheap.
Look,
Yeah, for real.
there are some wild rumors right there where it's like maybe European players are not only pigeonholed into like having to sign for one of the NA teams. Maybe there's also a possibility that whatever happens in APAC is interesting, right? Like that we practically don't know what's going on there. There is some precedent that some of those teams have looked at Western players, at least in the past. I'm not sure if that at all will happen. There's, of course, like the rumor mill is always wild. I will say this year, the intentional noise in the league sphere is pretty high. I think people just also tried either to mole hunt or to put some wrong stuff into the ether and see who bites. So that one was definitely possible that it's not going to happen. But generally speaking, like during a recession where the marketing dollars isn't as readily available.
True.
And the general like an issue in marketing or like gaining revenue in this league, that it unfortunately is the case that the region with where you still need visas, where you still need to provide housing for these guys, and where those guys do not have the visibility because they're not playing against these players. I think a not insubstantial amount of scouting happens when your star player plays against a guy in ranked and gets humbled, like maybe in one or two of these duels or whatever. And that unfortunately is only the case for European talent right now, when all those European players maybe was it family go on to EU ranked and whatnot. And otherwise, it's hard for all the Overwatch League knowledge to also seep into the ranked play, into contenders.
The level of just the average ranked top 500 queue in EU is like generally just lower because of the lack of those players really capping out the top of it. So, I mean, I've heard that be a complaint amongst a lot of top players there because they're playing on NA just to play against better competition a lot of the time. And like for good reason, it's because not only does it do that, but it gives you the potential scouting opportunities that you were talking about. Like, yeah, if you clap proper on the right day of the week, yeah, maybe somebody's available to check you out. And so there's a lot of things standing in the way of these players, and there's unfortunately, I think only a few ways around it. Another one of the big things we were talking about before we got in the call was just what I believe to be just an overpopulation between contenders in the Overwatch League, right? Because we brought up so many people mid-season last season, like an insane number. Yes, they were coming from NA, but it doesn't matter because new people came up to fill those NA slots, and now NA contenders in Overwatch League have about 1.5 to 2 times as many people as there would normally be competing for those spots. And unfortunately for EU, though they weren't the ones getting picked up last season, they still have to compete against 1.5 times as many people.
Yeah. The hopium here for Europe is one thing that people yes, but what people that have been around in esports will sometimes notice is if you leave a region isolated for long enough, they develop their own ideas that just eventually will beat the established meta game or every once in a while. Like people will remember, like, I don't know, Worlds a couple of years ago where the Turkish team was able to go very far based on like a wild any meta type stuff, right? Like
Supermassive.
Was that a Turkish team?
I think so.
The problem with that though is like a lot of the time we were talking about, like Saudi Arabia being one of those teams in the next World Cup to watch because of the pharmacy meta.
Right.
But Overwatch League teams have shown time and time again they don't want one tricks. And you can say, oh yeah, EU teams are going to be able to establish their own metas, and it might be able to beat what everyone else has established as their own meta. But if it's a team that is only running that composition, they're not going to get picked up. How many times have people said, oh, Yazan's the best Pharah in the world, he should be in Overwatch League, and then they goes, no, we don't want Yazan in Overwatch League because he can only play Pharah and Echo, and that doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, here's the Steelman argument for that theory, though, is I feel like not an insubstantial amount of success that the Spitfire had last year was probably due to that. They had a pretty unorthodox strategy. I don't think playing a solid Reinhardt is not something that a lot of people now have access to. There was only so many, right? And bringing all of that over, having also taking advantage of like some scouting inefficiencies. Like nobody really looked at Backbone like that. Yes, he was like maybe in a Glad's trial or whatever, but like he eventually got picked up, and just the progress that they were able to make. I think there's probably a pretty big market inefficiency in terms of the raw talent that exists in Europe. Unfortunately, you would have to pry a little bit, give them trials, give them the ability to improve in order to, actualize their full potential. But, I think for those that are willing to invest, eventually they will just strike gold.
And don't think you're too clever, Moxie. I saw that plug in there. We're talking unorthodox. I've seen Kaiser and Necros. These guys can cook, Clockwork Vendetta style. But before we get into some of these big names that I think people are clamoring to kind of hopefully shine a light on, we do have to thank our patron producers, that being, and our YouTube members, Avril Vista Baby, Battle Crab, Refined Bean, Bronzebot Buhau, Picasso, Chris R34444, Kasha67, Lolshin, Pork Chop Sammy, Rexane, Stuck in Bronze, and our YouTube members, Ice Jello, William Jess, Fishman, Fire Helmet, AK Chris R, Brother, Stuck in Bronze, Samuel Espaza, Adam L, and Sagi Fumi. Now, there's one team on the lips of anybody who's paid attention to Contenders Europe for a hot little bit. It feels like the O2 of Europe. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, bro love.
Shout out to bro love. Let's go, Oni God. Let's go, you kids. But Ex Oblivione is just, they dropped a map, 2 maps?
They dropped 1 map.
They
until
improved
grand
upon
finals
their B-side score and run it back by 1 map.
But the grand finals was a 3-0 instead of what it was in B-sides where it went to 4-3.
It looked like they were going to do slightly worse. I was, making jokes about, they're falling off because they lost 1 more map in the group stage than they did last time. And then they went and dropped a 1 map through the entirety of the bracket this time and just stomped their old record. Like, I can't even make the joke anymore.
Right.
You couldn't really make it in the first place though, because every single team at the start of Run It Back were trying to adjust into the Winston meta, and EXO, like, they had 1 week where they tried to run kraandop on control. First of all, it was up against Raspberry Races, and Raspberry Races came out with an Arista composition which threw an absolute curveball into the mix, and then they subbed KSA in and just rolled because his Roadhog absolutely steamed everything in its path. And then we saw EXO play next, and they were running kraandop, and they were the best team in the region at running that Winston comp, and it had taken them like a week to be able to learn everything, and they just flew through every single match afterwards.
Jesus. I mean, this is a team that has, names that I think are, people should be
recognize.
With.
Yeah.
Shockwave, Psycho, KSA, if you've watched Overwatch League seasons in the past, Kellex. At this point, I think you have to just call him a gatekeeper. And a couple of rookies, if you've paid attention to Contenders or even, the amateur scene for long enough, I think you probably have seen kraandop around. Slay's not a name that I'm super, super familiar with, but is this a team that you guys believe? Maybe not even just a team. Are there like gems here that you'd love to see picked up? Like, how does Ex Oblivione kind of fit within the off-season shuffling of the rosters?
Honestly, like, let it rip. I'll give you a take afterwards. I think it's a little bit different.
Okay.
So there are 2 things that I think like I could see EXO happening. EXO are by far like they're Overwatch League ready. A lot of them have already been up into Overwatch League, like Shockwave, Psycho, KSA, Calyx. They've all like done stints with Overwatch League teams. And if we were talking about like full roster pickups, I could maybe see Defiant, because we don't know Defiant's roster at the moment, just taking all 5 of them. Sure. But if they get split up, I can definitely see a couple of members having a lot of luck in certain teams. I actually had a mini mind map where I was thinking about, okay, where exactly would these players fit in best? And I think London could actually, if they take KSA or Chase Torch from Raspberry Races, if they take one of those tanks to have just as backup, because Hardy is obviously very good individually as a tank, but the hero pool doesn't have a lot of overlap between what KSA or Chase Torch like to play. And then if you pick up KSA, you want to pick up Calyx, because the synergy between that Roadhog and that Lucio was absolutely insane. KSA came in and just absolutely rolled everyone because Calyx was enabling him. And then there's one specific support player I have to talk about. It's an affront to me that he's never been in Overwatch League. He's the perfect age. He's like 20. Slay, like you said, Volamel, like you said, you didn't really know about him in the past. But when we had the Brig meta all the way back in like Overwatch 1, he was actually one of the Brigs that a lot of players in Contenders level really didn't want to go up against, because he was known as the best Brig in the region. And we thought, okay, well, maybe he's going to have a little bit of a struggle adapting into Overwatch 2. Brig is out of the meta. Kiriko is coming in. He's the best Kiriko in EU, hands down. He's absolutely the best Kiriko. So not only do you want to take him because he's flexible, but he's also very strong at adapting very quickly into different hero styles.
So he's the flex with like a Brig. Like he's that flex support, got the Zen, got the BAP, but can also be like that mean Briggy to kind of dabble. And that's not something that yes, we've seen it in the past that like, oh yeah, we'll just throw the flex support, the Brig, and they'll do it fine. But the fact that he's kind of thriving and making a name for himself as that best Brigitte in the region, I think that's something I think people need to kind of keep an eye on. Now, Dor, it sounded like we were getting a 1-chip challenge out of you.
Yeah.
What's that one bite?
I'll just toss my chips in kind of a whole different direction.
Okay.
Something I wanted to comment on with this team. I'll start off with Slay, since that's where you guys were going. Like, I think the through lines can really be drawn to like an EU CJ. I think CJ has the experience up that, and just being an NA, that kind of makes him far more likely for a spot in the Overwatch League. But Slay certainly is there. But Slay and Calyx in this support lane highlight what I think the team has done more than any other team in EU. And there's really like you look at the talent in EU, it's insane. The density is stupid. You're looking at a team with Onigod, you could choose Levitate and Ripa that are just going 1 and 9. Like, clearly this region has a lot of talent. So how do you have a team that is as dominant as EXO in a region that is as stacked as EU is? And I think the answer is they're just playing Overwatch 2 better. Like, straight up, you look at the things that were finding team success in Overwatch 1, right? Whether that's having the correct flow chart working for you, whether that's having a team that plays really tight together, etc. Versus Overwatch 2 having the ability to output different things, whether that's space, damage, or healing / peel, from every single role. And I think that's what the players on EXO are doing especially well. You notice every last one of these players is capable of kind of filling each of those roles from their own role especially well.
Okay.
And the sport lines are almost always the real exemplifiers of this right now. You look at Kellex and Slay, one of the big stat numbers that we were using throughout the previous two things of Contenders, B-sides and Run It Back, was literally just final blows on the Lucios and Kirikos combined. And consistently, like by a enormous margin, the teams with Lucios and Kirikos with greater final blows, and this isn't just being farmed off of like fights that they had already won.
Sure.
These are first picks coming out of accurate Kirikos or FD God just inting into your team's backline. And it was such a humongous advantage. That extra, 4K damage over the course of the map is a lot of pressure to really contend with. And the same thing goes for DPS. I think Psycho has done this especially well for this team, and being able to be a great supportive player for Shockwave. Don't get me wrong, Shockwave, incredible. But Psycho has been an important part of that and plays almost a Molanran-esque role in DPS that I really admire. And then the tanks are doing well for themselves in Overwatch 2 in the slightly more independent roles as well. KSA, like you mentioned, on the Hog, and kraandop just playing well with Kellex and Slay. I think those guys just synergize particularly well. But that's a highlight for me for this team. Each of these players really seems to fit into Overwatch 2 well, and that's what I think makes them exciting and head and shoulders above the rest of these teams, because the talent is stacked. Mechanically, all these teams are there. Game sense wise, they're there, but it feels like EXO kind of have that fundamental lack of hyper focus on their particular role, on the players that are actually playing it. It seems their skill sets are just more suited to the game, and I think that makes them all very, very powerful, especially when you put them with one another.
Sure, and I don't think that's like completely like something that I think people are going to maybe not discount, but like, oh yeah, what's the big difference? Like one less hero, yada yada. Like we're seeing that even at the highest level. I think one of the biggest like criticisms that I think you could leverage against like the 2022 Shanghai Dragons is that like, and something they kind of came out and said, I think Moon had said in an interview, that like we're just not adapting to Overwatch 2 well. Like, and I think at least for my soapbox, like I thought Flooded was kind of taking the brunt of that, but Yiska, is there a world where you feel okay? Like where do you kind of sit with hearing that like Psycho of like former Vancouver Titans? Like, we saw a couple games from him. I don't know about you, but I wasn't super thrilled. But like hearing what they're saying, you think you give him a second chance? You think you can probably bring him in?
Look, I have a lot of respect for people who opt to, try to win the Gulag and make it back into Overwatch League. But
European Gulag, all right, that's fair. That's fair.
But like, I think that I'm particularly interested, of course, in guys like FD God, who it was probably to many, maybe a little bit of a shock that after, no pun intended, having that season with a shock that he didn't find employment after.
Yeah, I know what this guy's doing down here, to be honest.
Does it feel like he's smurfing?
Yes.
Like I think there are two support lines in EU Contenders between Kellex, Slay, FD God, and Canal. And then I think Zerion also is pretty good, maybe not to that level, but when we're talking about being good at Overwatch 2 and having that pressure role where you're making space and doing damage on the support line, FD God, Canal, Kellex, Slay are all very good. And FD God, even after not getting repicked up, then moving to Overwatch 2, now there's even more reason to pick an FD God up.
I'm gonna throw another name though in. Like, I think Crispy is a really good Lucio. He was doing a lot of damage. I remember there was like one game specifically that he just face tanks a Sojourn mid overclock and gets away with it. The problem is that Crispy is a little bit more inconsistent. Like, there's a reason that we talk about all those other Lucios so often, and that's because we've seen them so often, and we know that they can consistently hit those highs and hit those DPS nodes. Crispy is a little bit more of an unknown, so he needs a little bit more time to be able to like settle into that role. But I definitely can see some of those Lucios that you mentioned all being picked up. FD God especially, because if you have a Lucio who can just go straight into that back line and 1v1 the Sojourn, it puts so much less pressure on your tank, because we were seeing things like the Winston Primal or just a Roadhog body blocking the Sojourn so that the rest of the squishies can live.
I think there's also
telling me that there's a world where there's like a European League on. I'm here for it.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say, Yiska?
I think there's a particular roster building meta aspect to consider here, which is, I think not too many teams will significantly go over the minimum roster size of like 6 or 7. I think Atlanta said they were done with 6. They interestingly opted into going into the double flex supports. There, my my point doesn't grip that well. But for everything else, if you only have 6 slots, your decision on who to double up on which role, I think very often should fall on tank, right?
I agree.
So that implicitly then means that the main support needs to be able in double flex support metas to, jump onto the Zen or jump onto the Brig or jump onto the, even though Brig, I mean, I'll die on that hill that Brig is not necessarily a main support hero, but basically, like, what I'm interested in is, did anyone show those chops off recently? Like, let's say I don't have the budget to have anyone else for the main or the flex support position, because let's be honest, like, it's very hard to justify just having a Lucio one trick on your team anymore, right? Like, it's
a luxury.
Like, even for Glads, I'm sure Funny Astro currently has to grind everything but Lucio in order to justify the position, because yes, having a great Lucio is very important for you, but it can't be the only reason why you're brought, right? So what about like the FD gods or the Calyx? Like, have they shown that flexibility into the flex supports?
So a lot of teams, actually, when we went to Circuit Royale, I'm sure, Dor, you noticed this as well, they wouldn't run the Kiriko Lucio, they would run the Bapsan. So a lot of players actually had to go on to that flex, and we did see players like Zerion having a very good Zen. Zerion is known for being a Zen player prolifically and being able to hit those really high DPS numbers, as well as keep himself alive for the longest time. And I think definitely because if it's a Lucio one trick, with how prolific Lucio has been in terms of the meta at the moment, I am very much expecting Lucio to get significant nerfs in the upcoming patches. So you do not want to just hitch your horse to a Lucio one trick in an Overwatch League roster, because he's probably going to be put down a couple of pegs in the future.
Yeah, I would argue this is a really hard conversation to have, because with A, B, and Run It Back, where despite Jodes going away, Lucio Kiriko is still just the support composition. So there's very little evidence that we have outside of Overwatch 2. And again, I do think it is a totally different environment in terms of what support players are particularly capable here. I do trust that it's doable, and most of the flexibility has been pushed onto flex supports, because I think as much as main supports learning for double flex is important, it seems to be the inverse that's happening more often for teams. Again, you highlight players like CJ and Slay, who are kind of shifting over between both roles with the Brig, which is, like the lightest of the main support arguments. At this point, it just is expected to have in your flex support pool. But I think the flexes are being asked to flex more often, and I don't think that Lucio one tricks is something that you can call any of these players at this point. I think, especially Calyx and FD God, like, come on, let's be real. They've been around for a hot minute. They've got a wide enough hero pool. They haven't gotten the opportunity to show it in Overwatch 2. But I think if you're talking about like the peak of mechanical and game sensibility on main support, it's going to be Lucio that you look at as like, okay, what is this player's peak on that hero, especially with how important it's been to the Overwatch 2 meta in general. Even with significant nerfs, it seems like it's going to be important. And then you go over to what you're talking about, which was, okay, so we want to flex our tank, which I think has become way more apparent in the past month or two. Like, initially it was like, oh yeah, we might be able to have one person, and then just like every time a meta comes around, they can just learn whatever hero is in that meta if it's not, and like they can just hyper focus on that. But I think Kevster are a really good example of why you can't do that right now, because incredible team. Like, there is no argument that in slot these players are all contesting for best. But it was largely off the back, and initially the storyline for the season kind of was, okay, BenBest is just a giga flex player. Like, we are having BenBest play literally every single tank in this video game. And initially it looked great because nobody knew what they were doing, and BenBest was just flexing to new heroes, and it was like, oh my god, what can't this guy do? But then at the end, once everyone's started to specialize, you realize that, like, okay, BenBest is clearly extremely good at a few things here, but trying to flex them onto like Sigma matchups became something of a difficulty, right? Circuit Royale went from what was one of their best maps to something that they ended up losing like 4 or 5 times in a row at the end in the bracket stage. So yeah, it almost definitely is going to be 2 tank players for these teams. And I think that the current meta has only solidified that further.
Yeah, because that would have been my follow-up question. Something that I think I don't know if the community's given it a name, but I think I'm just gonna run with the term unicorn when it comes to like the tank player that can just hyperflex it around. That Smurf, that someone-esque player that can just kind of do it all. It sounds like maybe BenBest fit that at the beginning of the season, but is there anybody else for your guys' kind of experience? Is there anybody else that kind of also fits that bill?
I see over in NA, and that's kind of it.
I was gonna say Chase Torch is a potential for that. Honestly, Chase Torch was
Chase Torch could do it.
Good player who was able to flex onto a whole bunch of different roles and was also able to punch. Like we talked about their first matchup of Raspberry Racers versus Ex Oblivione, and it is so prolific because Chase Torch comes out on the Orisa and absolutely smashes expectations because they are not expecting the Orisa, they're expecting the Winston. And they had kraandop in because they were thinking there's going to be a Winston on the other side, we're going to be able to go for the mirror matchup. And because Chase Torch doesn't have to get subbed out to be able to play either the Orisa, the Roadhog, or the Winston, Raspberry Racers were able to find a lot of value. So I think if anyone else other than maybe BenBest or Vestola, who's also very good at flexing their hero pool, we got to see Vestola going up against BenBest, and it just became rock, paper, scissors. Of one of them would go into one tank, lose the matchup, come back in another tank entirely, and then the other one would lose that matchup, go back to spawn, come back on another tank entirely, and we would just be sitting there going, okay, we've now seen every single tank in this entire game in one match.
Yeah, the only hero that we didn't get, fun fact, through Run It Back was Moira. So
really?
Yeah, that's true.
that was the only hero we were missing. Everything else got played.
Crazy.
Wow.
Ball got played.
All got played. Doomfist got played. Zarya got played. Winston got played. Obviously.
Junker Queen got played into the ball, which was funny.
Okay,
that's the only reason that existed.
Okay, I could that makes a little bit of sense, but that's really interesting. That I mean, just from like the going from like Jotes into like, oh my god, the character's dead to okay, well, there's some.
Well, it's still good into the other bad character.
Yeah, true. If we're playing bad character meta, well, boy howdy, let me tell you, I got some bridges to sell you.
Yeah.
But when it comes to I think the tank role in general seems to like be this new like focal point. It seems like in general, when we've gone through and talked to some of these contenders experts, it seems to be like there have been styles kind of like formed and fit to their tank players. But as I'm even like going through Wikipedia and looking at these, like there's not a ton of just like single tank lineups for a lot of these European teams. But did you guys still feel like there were styles set? Did you guys feel like there were certain, like for Peps, it sounds like maybe early on they thrived on, more main tank or traditional main tank heavy maps, and then maybe kind of fell a little bit back on like the Circuit Royals and the Dorados where like the flex tanks kind of tend to shine? Were those styles kind of apparent to you this era of Run It Back?
I mean, I think the styles were largely dictated by what you had access to.
Okay.
Like BenBest obviously being just like a hyperflex in kind of every sense of it was phenomenal at the start. And once you got into the specialization, having like Exo play monkey into every map, and you're like, okay, well, what do we do? This hog just like isn't working.
Sure.
And, like it's BenBest, like you only got so much hog experience. Yes, he's a hyperflex, but like the amount of specialization that you get out of like kraandop and KSA and having 2 tanks is just hard to kind of match. And then you have teams that I felt super bad for, who had like a hog player and then another who would have like a main tank player who could play hog, which is like doesn't tend to align with like the Reinhardt Winston kind of main tank player, right? And then they'd have an off tank player who could play like the Diva the Sigma and just could not play monkey for their life, and then they got forced into playing Diva all the time. And it was like some of them looked all right, and you're like, yeah, but is it just because this is a good Diva player because the Diva pick's good? We interviewed John actually at one point towards the end of the season about it, and he's like, yeah, realistically, it's like it's just a comfort thing while you're going to the Diva. Like the Winston is in most cases objectively better, and a lot of teams got forced into an air quotes style for that reason. Okay. But I think it's largely just due to the fact that they might not have had that key piece in a meta that was really, really weird, especially with the whole Roadhog thing. Like, main tanks that play Roadhog generally don't play other traditional main tanks, right? At least maybe not to the capability that you would want out of an experienced Winston player. So it was a semi like meta thing, semi roster thing. But I think Overwatch 2 is a good game in the fact that it did still allow those teams to play while flexing. So that was nice to see, but still, though I think the whole style thing is more so an element than Overwatch 1, but still often forces teams to fall a little short.
Sure.
I think to sort of like touch on Doe's point a little bit further as well, like a lot of the time we could track the compositions that teams would be bringing out when they sub-played specifically in. Like NKZ especially would come in when a team wanted to play Roadhog. KSA for EXO would come in when they wanted to play Roadhog. A lot of the time, however, it was just players prizing that Winston meta. And I believe it was Young and Beautiful. I remember they had an absolute awful matchup where Vestala was not available to play and they had to have Lulzish go in, and they couldn't sub him out, so they were just forced to continuously play the Winston until we saw like them try to change into the Roadhog on Eichenwald, and it worked for a little bit, but because he's just not that Roadhog experienced player, it just did not work for this team, which was a real shame, because that matchup was a rough one to say the least.
Yeah, even just from like some cursory viewing of some of the VODs and even trying to catch some of the matches towards the end of playoffs live, it seemed like very like, okay, on this map there's this kind of established meta, and on this map like Hog's a little bit better. There is this prevailing idea that like the Winston is like ideal, but it's hard to execute. So there was a lot of, it seemed like there was a lot of like tank rotation play going around and not having that.
It was like the rock, paper, scissors. Every single time we saw tanks come through, it was always just rock, paper, scissors. And I think that plays into Overwatch 2. Like, I actually had a really interesting conversation with Man of Class, another caster, a couple of weeks ago, where we were talking about the fact that Overwatch 2 doesn't punish you for having to swap role or swap hero if you lose that first fight, because you get to retain that 30% ult charge. Sure. So if, say, like on Control, you come into that first fight and you're running something into a counter of your own, you lose the first fight, you get to go back, you get to swap onto something that counters that, but you get to keep your ult charge. So you're at a better advantage of winning the fight the next time, and you're at a better fight for winning the next fight after that because you have an ult and your opponent doesn't.
True. Definitely been rhetoric is a strong word, but like that like 20xx like game theory of the game has definitely been pretty prevalent. I think
the thing is, sometimes you have to see the data in order to establish a trend there, right? Like, for instance, I remember there were often some very counterintuitive interactions where you would think, for instance, first picks were negated in relevance when a Mercy rests the player. Turns out was just as impactful. Like, just having that on cooldown was essentially a being one down in during Overwatch 1. And that type of stuff, you would have to look at it. I think I also saw that argument made on by SVB. It certainly follows to logically. You just sometimes have to see, like, maybe there's a lot of breaking points that you're hitting in that first fight or in the consecutive fights where you're just that little amount short on your ultimate. And therefore, even like in a less opportune situation of the counter, that break point then more often than not brings about a situation where it's still pretty disadvantageous. And everything that brings about the non-snowbally nature of random picks, I suppose, is probably pretty good for the game, right?
Well, I would agree, and I think that was actually one of the cool shifts that we saw during the meta, was teams trying to dodge that, especially in the matchups that they just felt confident that they could win. Team Peps was, I think, for my money, the first team to really implement it, at least on broadcast. I'm sure it was being played in scrims by probably a few teams prior to then, but on basically every control map, they just locked Orisa, because it was just a safe thing. Like, it didn't get countered. It was like, it's going to be all right into everything. It's neutral. And that's the advantage of having a BenBest, whose hero pool is so wide that you can just kind of be like, yeah, hey, we need an Orisa because it's like all right here. And he's going to give you an all right Orisa, like at the very least, if not like a very good one. And so a lot of teams towards the end started to adapt that to dodge the rock, paper, scissors as best they could. But whether or not that's good is up for debate,
Well, true, yeah. Opening 3 hatch into Forge First expansion is
right.
special. I'm more of a cheeser, I want to, get that.
Yeah, I quit when I see that.
elbow deep. Hey, that's my ladder points. That's all I'm saying. Anyways.
But okay, so we're bringing BenBest up so often. Yeah. I try to get this off my soul, the question that I'm about to ask. But unfortunately, I'm too much of a Redditor. Then I'm emulating the Reddit question that inevitably will be asked about this. Okay, so I'm going to give you the Reddit question. You already know it's unfair, so brace yourself, right?
No.
So Amaz gets the GM head coach position at DC. We know maybe by the time this releases, it's already public. We know from the leaks that it looks like that both BenBest and FD God have made it onto his team. Of course, French Mafia has once again succeeded, right? It's the Redditor speaking. It's not my opinion, but if someone came to you and said, "Well, this is obviously a nepotism," right? Like, why not pick up someone like, I don't know, whoever is around? Like, even if that roster is true, he could have also picked up someone from Contenders Korea, and why not 2U? Why BenBest? Oh, this is obviously nepotism. How do you defend against the Redditor that asks this?
So I think a part of it might be visa. Like, BenBest might still have visa left over from when he was with Paris Eternal.
Fox, you're not defending him.
I'm trying to see the logic. Okay, I'm trying to see the logic, because I agree. Like, honestly, I would have rather seen a player like Chase Torch get picked up, because we've already talked about how fluid his hero pool is. He's also of that age. He's just coming in to be of the age for Overwatch League, so you can have that argument that we see Odyssey doing a really good job of, where they pick up these talent and they keep them and they mold them and they give them this platform and they allow them to just build and flourish in their careers. That's why Odyssey has found a lot of value with Rhino, with Tree that we're seeing over on NA. I think Chase Torch could be that player that you pick up. He has already got all of that fluidity in his hero pool, and you just allow him to become even greater than he already is.
Yeah, as the requisite French hater on the
here we
broadcast, which I had a great time. I want to be honest, I just ran the bit the whole season of just making fun of Team Pepsi.
Your mentions look great, right? On Twitter.
I know, dude. That was fun. That was a good time. Respect the Peps though, and respect to the French players, because nah, dude, they got the beans. They're good enough. BenBest and FD got I've kind of highlighted Team Peps and what I thought was a little bit of their shortcoming in the latter part of Run It Back, but I don't think that was at the fault of BenBest, who was being asked to play literally every single tank on the roster, and I would still consider him better than most players in EU Contenders at any given tank. But still, I do think it against an Ex Oblivione, that's just enough. So still back him up with that tank, but he's still incredible, and would be deserving of a spot. FD God, I think, is ultra deserving of a spot, as I was highlighting earlier with the supports thing. And if you want to continue down the France rabbit hole, I think Natlox and Zerion also look particularly good. And I think those two have a bright future. So yeah, no, dude, the French players are just good. I don't know what to tell you. There's no cope about it. They got it.
Yiska, you kind of brought up London and their Rhine, gimmickery early on in the season. I think people tend to forget that BenBest
he did it first.
Got a pretty nasty Rhine. So I don't, if you want to enter the mind palace or become, Doctor Strange for a moment and just, run through the laundry list of what kind of DPS are still on the market and how BenBest could be running Rhine and they could be the new London, and maybe Vancouver Titans just trounce them anyways. I don't know. Anyways, I'm just saying, if the rumors are true and justice do land with BenBest, they could, be a little colorful. They could have a style to them. It's certainly possible.
Yeah, I think that will be inevitably important for a roster. I mean, it is if you look at that roster, it doesn't look like a budget team. It still pretty much is a budget team, right?
Yeah.
But I think the general idea here will still be that you probably don't just want to go, pound for pound, just take ego challenges with, which you could with our DPS line, right? But at the same time, you got to find something that differentiates you, not least in order for me to win the Lord bet, in order to, get ahead of, teams like Vancouver. And I am I am interested to see like just how it eventually turns out in terms of the color that we very often talk about. What DC could be developing there, because not least if you're just one guy coaching, that comes down to a lot of the players and the input they have on the strategy and how that synthesizes, not least in a hybrid roster. So hearing that like BenBest and FD have kept up, maybe even improved from what we've last saw them. And then also, I mean, if people remember season 3, like once they had those incredible players around them, they naturally adapted to everyone else. I think it's also like you get better scrim blocks. Your level just naturally changes. Of course, at the same time, like if those exact 2 players end up being like the cruise ship anchors to your team, I think rightfully one would then have to face some criticism there, right?
Sure, of course. If that's like the weak links, then if those are your guys, then we gotta have a little talk. But
And I feel like the team itself is just like a very much we're trying to cover all of our bases, because like we know that Overwatch League is probably going to be played on a future patch. We know that the patch is definitely in the meta is going to shift dramatically. Roadhog's going to get a rework to come through. Junker Queen's going to be getting a couple of buffs. And the fact that you've got, if the rumors are true, if Alfie gets picked up as well, Jor and I have seen like he's got a really good tracer, but he's also able to flex onto things like the Echo. So depending on what the actual meta is, they're going to have a lot of their bases covered. And because they're picking up a player like BenBest and FD who are known for being able to flex through all of these different heroes, they're still going to be able to hit all of those different compositions without having to really have all of these different players that you sub in per map or meta.
I love hearing some happy things about Alfie.
I love Alfie. Don't I, like we did a stint in Contenders China. We got to see Alfie rise, and it was just an absolute pleasure to get to watch the guy absolutely rampage through roster after roster, whether it was the Tracer, whether it was the Echo. He always performed.
Non-existent producer, can you zoom in on Yiska's face when I ask him about a Prita and what he's up to?
Come on, man. You can't do me dirty like that.
Oh,
That's all I'm asking is, I picked a person twice in our improper rookie draft. You seemingly lucked out on a Prita.
Yeah, what did Alpha do last season?
He pounded on the Spark.
I only saw losses for this team.
I didn't see your player at all.
Yeah.
Checkmate, atheist. DPS. There's one name, I've tried to speak. I tried to speak to a couple people last year ahead of the 2022 season. I had pulled one of the NA experts aside that dabbled across. I won't name names because I don't know if they want me to name them. And a name that I definitely did not have on my radar was a young and beautiful DPS, Maimone.
Yes, WMaimone. Oh,
it's been around a hot minute. Like
he was
has been just definitely not on my radar. And they were like, "Yo, like if this guy comes back, like you gotta watch out for him. He's nuts. He's cracked. Like you gotta have seen him come back. Definitely played this season." So I need like a refresh. I need, more people to know about Maimone because apparently he might be the truth.
Yeah. Honestly, like, if you ever want to see a Maimone game, whereas I had it in my notes because he popped off like crazy. There was one game in specific where he stalls this card for like 3 minutes straight. There it is. Versus Raspberry Racers, playoffs day 1. He stalls on defense of point A for like 3 entire fights, just himself on that card, goes through like 4 different pulse bombs. And he lives. He lives and he buys them the entire match. His tracer is absolutely nuts, not just at being able to like create so much space, but play the objective. I would say between him and Yoko, who also is a really good tracer player, they play the objective, especially on push maps, perfectly. They see an opportunity. There's one match where everyone's fighting on the high ground on New Queen Street around the statue to secure that space for their Sojourn. No one's contesting the bot. The tracer immediately blinks down to the bot, takes full control, and starts everyone now having to reposition, and you catch the entire team out because they're stuck in that reposition mode. Their backs are turning, and your Sojourn set up in space.
Yep. Is this somebody that you kind of have on your radar as well, Dor?
Yeah, dude. I think it's so hard to talk about EU and DPS because
okay,
like of the roles, I think this is the most like individually stacked in terms of just sheer mass of players. Like I think there are some incredible sports coming out of Europe, but the thing I'm not 100% sure if I'd put my money on like, okay, like all of Europe is hyper dense with like support talent.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And then Tank definitely has like a few really good standouts, and then it like you hit like okay, they're really good for contenders, but are they like good for Overwatch League level? Question mark point. The DPS in Europe are just a little dumb. And I think Maimone is another dumb one amongst many dumb DPS players that are just freaks of nature mechanically in Europe. I think the question is now, how do they fit into a team environment? Sure. Brings me again back to what I was talking about with EXO and why I think Shockwave and Psycho were so particularly good for this team. It was their ability to kind of play outside of their role and peel and be able to support the team outside of just getting frags. Because I mean, we saw Yoko pop off, we saw Maimone pop off, we saw Cookie pop off, we saw Quartz and Yubi, who I thought worked together particularly well, right? Hybrid, who was just a pile of headshots in a team that was like struggling to find consistency. I actually I have the message from when they asked for my predictions, and it was straight up like, okay, how they were asking for my top 3, and at this point we were like 1 round into the bracket, right? And the question for me was like Munich Esports or Peps. And I saw Peps, if they lost, they had to play up against Twisted Minds, who they had like struggled up against before, because I think Peps had a few like mental issues at some point. And then I was like, all Munich Esports has to do is have Hybrid carry at least 2 games for them. And then they're just like into the top 3. And I was like, yeah, Hybrid could do that. So again,
somebody you're willing to bet on?
Yeah, I don't know if it's like Overwatch League yet. I think there's still some refining to do with Hybrid. But mechanically insane. And then like Ken, a great sniper player. LED showed a lot of improvement, run it back. Alexi as well. Love Cio, Shockwave. The DPS is like, you highlight Maimone, but you can't not highlight literally anybody in like the top 5 teams, at top 6 teams, if not more than that, right now for these guys. So
that's so interesting.
It is insanely difficult, and I think the question now doesn't fall on like, okay, we saw some crazy performances from Maimone, or we saw some crazy performances from Cookie, or we saw some absurd shots hit by Hybrid. It's like, no, how well do they fit into the team? Right. How well are they playing roles outside of their own? And I think that is legitimately the significant difference maker for Shockwave and Psycho. Because I don't know if you watched any of the games, like Shockwave was doing well, of course, right? Like winning a lot of his matches, but it wasn't in like the dominant way that Hybrid is, or the crazy pop-offs that we saw. It was like consistent value, staying alive, playing properly with the team, peeling for his tank, like that kind of thing. That's really setting DPS apart right now.
I'd say consistency for sure. Like you talk about Cookie. Munich was the biggest surprise for me for the entire year. Like Munich coming along in A sides off of open division and then beats everybody to win A sides, and we're like, okay, this team are absolutely monsters. Cookie is the best surgeon in the entire region. What's gonna happen? And then B sides hits. Cookie gets traded off to SMC, and we're thinking, okay, maybe this is gonna go well for this team. Maybe they're gonna be able to really play off of this guy's surgeon play, and it goes awfully, horrendously. Wow. And then Run It Back comes along and Cookie is back to that high level that we saw in A-side. So I think for me, it really is about the consistency, because players like Quartz, players like Yubi, players like Yoko, every one of those, like you mentioned, all had pop-off moments which are extremely memorable and definitely highlight worthy. However, not a lot of them were really consistently able to continue to hit those highs. Shockwave and Psycho, I think, were the best just because consistently they were doing the most amount of damage, they were getting the most amount of flatter deadlifts. We got to see, really, and I don't know how much of that was down to the individual skill or how much of that was impacted by everyone else on the team, because, like we said, EXO were the strongest team in the region because every single player on every single one of those roles was the strongest, the most consistently strongest at that.
And I think, Dor, you kind of like unknowingly, and I think maybe you purposefully did this, so correct me if I'm wrong. It's an interesting kind of narrative point, especially when you look at like the history of the Overwatch League. It does seem that like Europe does just export main supports a lot of the time, where it's just like, oh, Boston gets a main support and Kellex is in the league, and like Big Goose, and like there's always like there's these notable like support players that just kind of come over from Europe. Not so much DPS, some tanks here and there, but a lot of the times it was just like, at least in my mind, and Yiska, maybe you can chime in here, like they were just the support region that was just like just churning out like great main supports, great Lucios, great Briggs, you know, just solid backlines. And to see that completely maybe 180 in some direction, where like every team's just got cracked DPS players, it's like, I almost want to like bring him over to collegiate. Like I want to just like who needs one? Like let's start like it seems like you can throw a rock in Europe, but you hit like a good DPS too. Like
that collegiate bit's not even a bad show. Like if you are just like a random college that wants to invest in your esports, like if you can pay for a plane ticket, like dude, I can immediately up your program right now, and I will charge you a very low consultation fee.
I mean, we know it works as well. We have the success story of Lethal. He was in EU, he got a collegiate spot, he got a scholarship in NA, and now he's finding a home in Redbirds, and Redbirds are doing amazingly in that collegiate zone.
How is Lethal?
Kids want to throw some money. Yeah, speaking of Lethal, yeah.
How was Lethal like in comparison to all the other DPS? Was he clearly standing out, or like just fitting in? Like what's a relative level here?
No, I think you can say that because like you've seen Redbirds the most in action as of recently.
It was weird, like Lethal and Vision, especially initially, because there were a lot of questions being asked of them, of like, okay, who's playing what DPS and whatnot, but Lethal was a kind of beacon of consistency for me, especially in terms of just raw performance. And so I think that's the real highlight to Lethal. And I think this comes for like a lot of teams, right? You want a player that's popping off, and you want a player that's gonna kind of provide you that consistency in the DPS line, and that seems to be a pretty good combo for most teams. And I think if you're looking for a consistent player within that role, like Lethal is definitely top tier. So I have very few bad things to say. Definitely like Overwatch League capable, definitely kind of expected in that regard. It is a major success in terms of like the EU to collegiate pipeline. That's 100%.
Yeah, I think.
Can we get a collegiate scene in EU? Please.
That's what's tough is I have to imagine a collegiate scene would be really, really difficult. But I think again, I'm gonna use the M word, like the big money question. I think what would work for Europe, and I'm speaking as an American, take it with a grain of salt, NA education system. But I think like what's worked at least in esports for Europe are those like those like regional leagues where it's like you have like the French league and the German league, like you have all of these like country based leagues that like I have to wonder if like a collegiate system really makes sense, but like it could be mirrored in this like I don't know why I'm blanking on the word, but like this regional country based,
No,
just like
I'm
Junior World Cup.
Yeah, sort of.
EU collegiate doesn't make much sense because most EU colleges and universities are kind of beacons for their given area, as opposed to like the massive state schools or like generationally backed colleges of America.
Right.
And so you tend to get more in like a very traditional esports grassroots scene, which is what I think you're imagining, right? Like old CS leagues and stuff that would happen more often in Europe, and how that's been esports' way of growing in Europe for a long time. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that popped up. I mean, obviously, like France is a center. There's plenty of other places that have the player base for it. And to some degree, I mean, Saudi E-League still very much a thing and is funding a lot of European Overwatch right about now. So, like, I think there is room for that, and players are willing to play in it. Money is always the question, which is what makes you, like, be like, yeah, dude, like, NA University just pick these players up because to them, the money it costs to fly somebody across the ocean, not that much. Like,
and
it is.
These colleges want to spend. Like, they have a budget to spend. They just actually don't know what to do with it.
Exactly, right? Scouting is the bigger problem for a lot of these colleges. I think it's one of the big things that sets, in particular, Northwood and Redbirds apart. Northwood, like, Redbirds have success in Overwatch, but, like, Northwood, if you look at what they do, right? Like, insane success across the board, largely thanks to Evolve. And just, like, I've firsthand seen the hours that man pours into just going into random players and, like, I'm going to use the word children here because they are of college age.
Sure.
As if I didn't graduate, like, a year ago. But just going into, like, random children's Twitch streams, and being like, hey, what's good? Just watching you play, like that kind of thing, and making those connections. It is raw hours that you have to put in, or you could just watch European Contenders, and like, and so in that way, it feels like there is kind of a gold mine here for collegiate, should it want to go that way, which I think is a little sad that we're talking about that, because the Overwatch League, as much as I think there was hopium that the whole EU visa thing would change. There's been no evidence to suggest that it will.
Yeah, it's
Sadly,
even
and for
worse there
all of
as
the
well.
concentration that there is here, it's always with an asterisk and a very sad one at that.
This the thing is, like, for the American viewers, the thing in European sports that historically replaces the collegiate system that you see in professional sports in North America is usually like, sports team academies that take these players on very early. They often have also education going alongside those youth programs, and even if not, then they still have extensive programs. I once coached taught a student who played for a local football club, and he would, like, every other day or almost every day, he would have to be picked up from the main station in order to go to practice, right? And they'd be paid a salary, and if they're good enough, maybe the club even employs the parents, that type of stuff, right? Of course, other than Schalke for a brief moment before they had to sell the LEC spot, no less at a high profit, but still, there just isn't that much interest in esports, so there is no infrastructure to grip into the esports development, and therefore it's very hard for, like, it's just another structural disadvantage that Europe has over behind, like, NA, that there is nothing really. Basically, Joe, in order to, like, so you understand, there's no pay pig.
No, I mean, EU's pay pig is slowly but surely becoming Saudi, but
Saudi Arabia,
yeah, which there. I think, like, it seems to be in a pretty healthy way, but if the scene starts to shift, it could obviously change, and you'd like to see that just diversified, so it's not one thing that if it stops, then just the faucets shut off,
Yeah.
Because that can become a very real problem, a very real threat if, like, that just starts to fail, and then you're like, oh, guess we got no money anymore. Like,
I guess the problem as well of, like, the Saudi E-Leagues thing, it wasn't just purely collegiate or contenders level, it was Overwatch League players as well. So
Still a
they
good
would
thing.
literally, it's a great thing to see, like, honestly, getting to see Overwatch League players and contenders players incorporated, because you can sort of use that as a mini trials as well before the trials had even started, to see whether or not a contenders player would still be able to beat out an Overwatch League player. But it doesn't really act as that traditional vein of collegiate in the way that it's not just collegiate players. It's literally if you're taking collegiate players and putting them into Overwatch League and just throwing them straight into the deep end and going, okay, now do something.
And is it, like, as cruel as that sounds, it's almost like a good thing, where it's like you are now, like, tested at like the hardest level, and after speaking with some of the Paris staff last or this year, I guess technically not when you're listening to this, but in 2022, like, listening to some of those guys talk about, like, how, like, yeah, we joined the league and it was rough, but, like, there is, like, tangible growth that, like, we've seen with these players, and it's like the more that you do kind of, like, run into that blender, the more you are going to be coming out the other side as, like, a, like, fresh tropical smoothie, and it's gonna take a minute and it's gonna suck, but, like, you will squeeze out blood from a stone eventually, and, like, we just need more of that. And I'm starting to come around to that idea of, like, if there was more ways for, like, the Overwatch League talent to, like, either integrate or even, like, play against some of these contenders talent, maybe like a
World Cup
match, like, World Cup too, like, which is great that we were getting it back, but it's just like that is going to, like, develop so many good players and, like, only push the overall, like, skill level of this game forward.
I'm kind of hoping that they go the way that Valorant has gone. Valorant has, like, 2 ways that you can queue. You can queue into ranked, or from next year, you're going to be able to, like, queue into servers that are specifically based around scouting opportunities. So I'm really hoping that maybe Blizzard does something in the similar vein, where, like, scouts can literally just use those, not have to worry about, like, going into streams of people who maybe are unknowns or having to watch both collegiate and contenders for every single region, but that they're going to be able to, like, sit in, and that Overwatch League players or collegiate players or contenders players can all just go into this massive mixing pot of people and potentially get noticed and picked up.
True.
Yeah, that's what Circus was for a while.
Yeah, that's kind of where, like, my head was
which
at,
was awesome.
like, it does like, I mean, I have to assume so, that, like, Europe has, like, its own, like, Circus servers, and, like, are they dedicated there, or are they just play on it?
Circus is,
I know it's, like, home run.
Yeah. So I mean, They did for a little bit when it was like super popular. There'd be EU specific stuff, and then I think they kind of merged at some point. So
I get it. I get it.
I think the players just wanted to play together more than anything else.
Oh, for sure.
And that was kind of realized, and then just everyone's on it.
Yeah.
If I remember, you know.
Sure. I mean,
take it with a grain of salt. I do not have Furix's history of circus.
No,
that man is a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah, he's been around the block. He's been around the block. Yiska, any thoughts there before I completely derail and ask these two fine experts about a thing that I've only created in my mind?
The only thing, like, I mean, we're sort of blasted past it, but there's one legend in terms of like someone that turned a lot of Overwatch League teams down. I think we know at least of one that was publicly talked about in Quartz, and I kind of wanted to pick their brains on Quartz because I can tell you, probably it wasn't probably Mayhem that was the only team blown off there. That's a young guy that, you know, said, like, I value my education over that situation. Also, probably not least due to, like, the economic situation in the Overwatch League at large. I think it's generally speaking, like, if you have other plans where your heart is at, you're basically playing esports in order to, you know, do something that you'd really like to do. And if that's not there, then fair enough, move on, right? But how was Quartz generally? Because it's pretty interesting that I think, like, I can just say there was more interest than just from the Florida Mayhem, right?
So Quartz, honestly, like, I think maybe a part of it is that Quartz wanted to go along with Yubi. Because, like, Dawes talked about this, Quartz and Yubi together were an absolute amazing tag team of a duo. Like, honestly, some of the best DPS synergy that we've seen in the entire Contenders region, both of EMEA and NA. Or maybe he wanted to just, like, hold off until maybe more stronger team approach him, because he has the chops to go to a really strong team. He was one of the best surgeons. His overclocks were always extremely memorable. They always either created space or got a lot of kills. And he also played with O1 Esports, which was a very strange thing to see because O1 Esports basically went through a massive identity shift between A sides, B sides, and Run It Back, where A sides and B sides, they were very vehemently a pharmacy based team, and then in Run It Back, they fielded two rosters, one which was pharmacy based, which went to Saudi E-Leagues, and then one which was closer to the Run It Back meta, and that meant that Quartz and Yubi would constantly be playing for that team, as opposed to sometimes being subbed out and taken in depending on which map that they were running onto.
Yeah, I think to explain a little bit why it seems like there's maybe like an inflated amount of interest in him, but I think there's a certain bias in coaches where it's like, as long as that guy can click heads at an astronomical rate, I can fix everything else. Which, okay, you do you. I'm not sure if that's true for, but like I think there's a certain propensity to go like, okay, mechanics, A, check, and then, oh yeah, he can communicate as well. Yeah, I get that boy talking, right? And it seems to me that like that at least the first box was checked. I'm not sure. Of course, I have no insight into intangibles there. What else was going on?
Yeah, I don't know. For me, again, this is like amongst a region with obscenely stacked DPS, Quartz is another one of them, which is like, not to say Quartz is not a very good DPS, and especially like for a team like Florida Mayhem, who already has Sermaj, another Saudi player, like it makes sense why you'd make an offer towards that, right? There is that synergy, there's a history there for those two. So, or actually, well, not 100% sure if Sermaj is back or not, but Sermaj is really good. Anyways, but yeah, like I think this is a player that's fully capable of getting an offer. We've seen kind of the rise of Quartz in Overwatch 2 specifically with a lot of the Sojourn. I thought Quartz had an incredible Ashwin given the opportunity, so I wouldn't be surprised if you're playing scrims and you're asking people to play different compositions and to play different things. If that flexibility that Quartz has hinted at really kind of blossomed and became something much more than just what we see on like the Contenders broadcast, that would be pretty unsurprising for him and would give him a leg up over all the clickhead DPS players that you're talking about. So yeah, I think it's unsurprising to see that like that is definitely a player that could get an offer, and if in trials where you have an opportunity to really put them, their pool, and their communication ability under a microscope, if that just became something that they were good and they showed some intangibles that we haven't gotten in AB and Run It Back, again with the prevalence of Sojourn being such a limiting factor in terms of scoutability for hit scan players.
It's
I
such a
think he's
weird
also
thing.
like got that sort of cover base thing because again he played with like 01, so he's played with off meta comps and he's played with on meta comps. And when we like talk to teams in interviews afterwards, we'd be like, how does it feel having to go when you fight 2 games in one day and you go against one on meta comp and then one off meta comp? How is that? And they're like, it's not fun. We don't like it. So I think because Quartz already has that flexibility of, as Dor mentioned, like being able to swap between things like the Sojourn, but also still having an absolutely nutty Ashe, he elevates himself massively. So if teams in trials throw curveballs at players to see how quickly they're able to adapt, Quartz has that leg up over some DPS players.
Makes sense, yeah. Yeah.
It seems like the more that like the more that I talk to both of you, the more that I'm just like, man, we do just need like just a couple more slots.
It's a couple more slots. I'm honestly I'm hoping for just a shift away from Sojourn, Lucio, Kiriko for those players specifically. They're just again with hit scans, it's like they're just all crazy. Like I'm not to tell you, it's Sojourn. Like everybody looks good. Anybody who can click ahead on like any given Sunday is just going to look like an incredible player. Until you get into the comms or into a trial where you can kind of force them to expand their hero pool or talk, you miss on some of the intangibles. And I think, like I said, Shockwave was one of the players that kind of exemplified going beyond that role, and you could see it in game. But I think other people are doing it in comms and in flexibility that we haven't had the opportunity to see yet. And I think that's something I want to see in the future out of other contenders tournaments, and hopefully out of some of the scouting reports from these teams.
Sure. One of the you kind of touch on flexibility in this like made up role that I'm calling, I'm testing the floor about. Okay. Is this like the third DPS archetype that like does all like the dirty work on like the weird junk maps and like maybe a Pharah player and like maybe they have an Echo and like it almost not just a backbone, but like almost like a backbone or like a libero or like somebody that just has like a really odd hero pool that you just like want to like keep around just in case? Is there like a player for both of you that kind of like fits that mold? Dor, I'll start with you. Is there any gadget players?
Naga. I like Naga a lot. I think Naga's flexibility this season was actually super important to Peps doing what they did.
Okay.
Obviously, you've got great players on that team. Love can play the hit scan very, very well. But Naga is playing everything under the sun, whether it was Mei, whether it was Echo, whether it was Genji, whether it was Hanzo, like literally everything. I honestly think having a pocket Hanzo player is low-key one of the most OP things in the video game right now, and I think it's so slept on. And so, I think that's a role that's very much become a thing. And that's not to say it's a thing for every team.
Sure.
Because we've seen, this is where I think some identity comes into it, of like working with what you have and understanding like who fits with who. Because it's not always the case. It happened a lot with tank players in this previous Run It Back, right? Where like they might have been lacking a particular tank that was in this meta and it just like bit them in the ass. And then, am I allowed to? Anyways.
Yeah, you're allowed to swear.
Yes. Okay. Bit them in the ass. And so, having a DPS lineup where you've got somebody like Love who can really just hyper focus on the snipers and the hit scan, and then have a Naga who can play everything else, and you're just gonna be fine. That feels really good. And I think there's a similar thing going on with Shockwave and Psycho. I don't think it's necessary though. I think you can have players that kind of do half and half as opposed to the hyper flex and specialist, which again there's a similar parallel in support, right? Where you have a hyper flex player and then like a Lucio Mercy 2 trick on the other role. So it's just how you want to play your own cards if your players lean into it. But whatever you do, you need to make sure that your bases are covered, and whether that's 50-50 or like 70-30, 80-20 is dependent on what players you get and whether or not you correctly identified their hero pool and covered it, their other bases.
Right. Moxie, for you, any weird
DPS? I have to agree. Like Naga was just insane. Because as Dawes talked about, like all of those points. Tank player, actually, I want to talk about Dom. Because we were talking a little bit earlier in the podcast about how there isn't really a tank player that we feel can cover both the Roadhog, the Winston, and the Orisa. Dawn is one of those outliers who can, and we saw him really have some amazing pop-up. It's like, yeah, Hybrid was an absolute star for Munich, but Dawn was really strong for this team as well. There were specific maps where he just carried because he was like, okay, do you know what? I'm done. I'm going to go Orisa, and I'm going to absolutely body tank diff you into the absolute dust. And I think having one of those tank heroes who can play all three of those as well as rock, paper, scissors, every other tank in the book is really important and valuable, because it means that if you do want to keep some of those subspaces open for either a support or a DPS, you have a tank that can do everything, and you don't need to have a sub for tank role.
I mean, that's good, but what happens when it's not this meta and you need?
Yeah, like you stole Naga, okay? I didn't just want to be like,
I think Dawn's a solid,
the only player.
Flexible main. Like I brought up the idea of like a main tank. Like most main tank players are either playing the traditional main tanks or they're playing like the weird Hog and like Sigma variant that was a main tank in Overwatch 1 when you played those specific Sigma compositions and when he wasn't played kind of as an off tank. And Dawn definitely falls into a weird category where he's like playing the traditional main tanks and happens to have a crazy Roadhog. But I don't think he's like a hyper flex. I think he's just got a little bit of a weird pool that might be a little bit bigger than.
That's definitely true. I definitely remember. I think I'm gonna just double check because I always get them confused.
He's definitely flexible.
He's definitely flexible. Weirdly good at wrecking ball, if memory serves. I think him for Paris was actually a weird.
Yes.
A weird.
Very true. Yeah.
I think. Yeah, because that was when Justice was woeful, and they took a. Cleveland
you have no idea how bad I want a ball meta Volamel. Don't even get me started. God, dude, how badly. I can't lament over NA teams. Never mind. I'll go on about GeForce some other day. Jurix will tell you that team was my baby.
I thought Florida were your baby though.
No, GeForce were my child. They did not get. They got so gypped by Overwatch 2. It is so sad. I hope they reform when ball meta comes around.
Hey, I mean, I think if Hog's getting gutted and they're taking a look at tank positions, you know, they'll juice them up a little bit. Any weird positional stuff, Yiska? Anybody you're looking at?
No, the thing that that I'm mildly confused about it, the metas that we've seen so far is like prior to Overwatch 2 hitting, like everyone's like, oh yeah, the single tank, like because we're playing the 3 DPS comes with the ball. Oh yeah, we're going to have a ton of ball. Literally the one tank that doesn't have a meta in the Overwatch League, like for any extended period of time, was ball, right?
To be fair, ball wasn't a factor of not fitting into the game. His stats just sucked.
Yeah.
Like I think he is still a hero that is very well suited to Overwatch 2. He's just mistuned massively. So,
sure.
He's mistuned, and I feel like he's falling. Not to completely drive this into a tangent, but he's quickly falling into like a weird, like you need a very specific skill set. And I think Doom's kind of like this, but to a lesser degree. But it's like the Lucios, the Tracers, the Sombras, the Wrecking Balls. Like you need almost a specialist to like thrive on it.
Yes.
And like they're just becoming like this Tracer luxury or this Lucio luxury where it's just like, cool, like it's a ball meta, give me a ball player, watch us get into playoffs, like watch us just punch up. Because like every time we get one of those like hard Lucio metas, it's no surprise that like Xerneas or Funny Astro or like FD God, like you guys have been talking about, you know, really thrive. And it's not to say that they can only play those heroes, but like they are absolutely world class.
Exactly. And like, yeah, it's kind of obvious for ball. The skill set is so outside of any other tank. But no, I'm not even gonna start, dude. Watching good ball players cook might be one of my favorite things on the planet. Cool. And not just good ball players, like ball in any meta shifts how your whole team has to play.
Yeah,
like hands down, just no questions asked. It doesn't matter how good you are, your team has to be good enough to play with ball, and so. Ball raises a lot of questions in shakier teams and teams without a ball player. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're playing that hero, but when it goes right,
yeah. So you gotta be fine with this. I'm the maddened Anna player who's chasing after the ball, being like, "Stay in line, don't go for a health pack. I'm 10% away from mana."
Sucks to suck.
Anyways, is there anybody for the both of you that you're looking at as like, I don't know if you're maybe an owl trial has dodged you. Maybe there's not enough slots. Maybe visa hell is a real thing. That has like kind of.
I don't know if that's a maybe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I'm just trying to be nice, okay? Trying to sugarcoat this as best I can. Is there anybody on like a bottom team that you're like kind of rooting for? You're kind of hoping like as this graduating class gets promoted, that they kind of like filter up into like those 01, those Ex Obliviones that kind of get promoted within your Contenders Europe. Moxie, is there anybody?
There's one player that immediately stands out to me, and it is Hira from Shoes Money Crew.
Okay.
Because this guy came along, he used to be on the sub bench, then Tracer meta hit, and they could finally play him. And he comes onto King's Row and he drops a 42 eliminations and a 2-death game.
Jeez.
I remember looking at the stats and be like, there's no way that's correct. He went from like 30 kills on the map before where he had something like 3 deaths, and then he comes onto King's Row and it's 42 elims and 2 deaths, and there's like double pulse bomb kills as well. Like he plays Tracer absolutely bombily, but we don't really get to see him because unfortunately SMC are one of those teams that are slightly lower down in the bracket. So a lot of the time here, because as well he's like a little bit newer to the scene too, he needs that time to really be able to develop and flourish and find his footing and identity, as well as being able to again hit that consistently. It's great if you can come in and drop a 42 elim 2 death, but you have to be able to pull that out consistently, otherwise we're just going to call it a fluke.
All right, I'm gonna give 3 shout outs here in increasing levels of coolness. Number 1, thematic, just for like heading up a lot of teams in between Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2, I think was just consistently in the scene. So I just want the best for him.
Okay.
Secondly, Sucrax, who I think has been particularly good. I think on a number of teams that have just not really looked that great, has performed well on Sheer Cold, and I am excited to see more of them, and I hope I get to see more of Sucrax on whether another roster or on the same Sheer Cold roster if they happen to find more success.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one, it's a deep cut. We're going into the staff levels of things. I want to say M3, who did some coaching over in Chinese Contenders and actually got onto onto the Shoes Money Crew EU roster literally as they were going into the bracket. Like they barely made it into the bracket.
Okay.
M3 comes along and like, I don't know what this man did, but he whipped the team into shape, like got them going, changed strategically what they were doing. Really just a complete 180 in terms of organization, in terms of positioning, in terms of map strategy, seemingly overnight. And every single player that we talked to had nothing to say but extremely positive things about him. He was incredibly kind on broadcast when we spoke to him in the interview, was super knowledgeable, brought a really interesting outlook to the game on top of that. And I think Hirix would say all the same things as me in every interaction I've had with him, whether it's been through Chinese Contenders or this, has been extremely positive. And I maybe selfishly hope he stays in EU Contenders to coach some more teams, because like this is a good team, but it was made significantly better with his involvement, and I suspect that he can cook a little bit more up if given the opportunity and the time, and hopefully not just brought in during a bracket stage.
What's interesting, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have this like very vivid memory, and I'm pretty sure it was M3, and I don't know who Shoes Money Crew is playing, but I think he was one of the interviews that you and Hirix did, you guys brought him on, and he kind of just gave this like really candid like opening of the playbook where it's like, yeah, we think this team like only plays well together, so we just like put our players on the wings, and was like really just like open about how they strategically just broke down this game. I couldn't tell you what game it was, maybe you remember, but it was like really poignant. It was like shockingly both candid and like smart. Like this is like the X's and O's stuff that like everybody wants to hear.
I think it was the 3-0 against Sheer Cold in round 6.
Possibly. I don't know. I don't remember.
But you know, it was. And it was also like that interview was just adorable. Like
it was so good.
Him talking about like his he sounded like a proud dad.
Yeah.
Like he was so excited for this team to be doing well and to watch like what he did succeed. And I think having that excitement in a coaching role is like, it really does trickle down to your players.
For sure.
There's no doubt about that. So yeah, I mean, that interview is speaking to the players about him has been just as much so. I really wish the best for him and whatever is to come.
Yeah, very like, if you can find it, I know that like mid broadcast content is always hard to find, but if you are like a Contenders head, like definitely look for it. I think you said it was the 3-0 versus Sheer Cold.
I think
like,
so.
It
was one of the last like 3 or 4 rounds for sure.
Easily one of the best. Like, and to be fair, I haven't like been entrenched in Contenders as much as I'd like to, but like one of those interviews that like really stands out is like, okay, like it felt special. So
it did
want to echo that as well. Yiska,
Joe, okay, here's. See, I asked the Redditor question to these two guys, and they handled it like with ease. So I thought in my brain, I'm like, who's the one group that's worse? That's conceivably worse, and is very like European specific. So I went, me being a man of the people in a very misanthropic way, went. Okay. What about the Twitter soccer profile picture crowd? Okay. And I asked them, those insider, like, European hardcore fans, who's, for instance, the best tank, right? Because those guys will say 0 good things about BenBest. I tell you that much. They will tell you that he's not top 5 in EU. And their chosen tank of choice is kraandop. And that's interesting because I've also heard him, like, trialing in a bunch of teams, and like if for a while, like he already was signed to some team or had a handshake agreement, which didn't turn out to be the case and whatnot. So what can you guys tell me there? Are the soccer PFPs for once correct?
I don't know if you probably haven't seen my second Twitter account is a soccer PFP. So I can definitely I get to talk. I get to talk. It's yeah. I can speak on this. No, if you want a player to fill your like main tank role, kraandop's insane. Like, just no questions about it. You should pick him up. And if you want a hyperflex tank, and then you want to like we were talking about, like there are those specialist roles, and not many teams have the ability to just like pick up a ball player. Like, but if you want to pick up a ball player, your other main tank or your other tank player should absolutely be a BenBest. Like, they bring very different things to the table. And so I think if you're looking for a main tank player, kraandop is definitely your no-brainer pick for the region. If you're looking for a hyperflex, BenBest is a no-brainer pick for the region. If you're looking for an off tank, you've also got some pretty solid options. I actually think that's the much harder argument to make. Maybe just because we got to see less of it. It was mostly like Sigma on Circuit Royale, and then people playing Diva when their team didn't have a monkey player. So that was like not a great kind of lens to look at them through. But the off tank pick's one that I would not want to choose.
Right. Yeah, I think in order to appeal to that crowd, you would have to at least use the adjective dog shit twice.
Yeah. Okay. Off tank, bit of a Mickey Mouse role, and and then in terms of dog shit players,
who's fraudulent?
Yeah, dude. I only got to watch like a little bit of Sheer Cold. I felt so bad for Crew though. Or True. I can't remember how to pronounce his name. He's like, Crew looked like he was having the single worst time playing tank of like anybody I saw in Contenders. And like, there are obviously like some tank like differences to be had there of like just playing against like kraandop and BenBest and stuff like that. But like it was a team gap, and like Crew is largely at the center of it, like of just getting all of the focus cyberbullied onto him. That was maybe the worst like oof I saw all season in terms of tank role, but I don't think that means Crew's bad. It was just kind of team gapping.
Joe, let's play that with those guys, because I'm interested. Like, I'm especially like in my mind, like
ask them who's lazy.
No, okay, that's your like that's your shtick. No, but okay, so let's play adopt an European player. Okay, so.
Cheers to Sarah McLaughlin. We're getting pulled down from YouTube. All right, continue.
Okay.
So, imagine you're the Vancouver Titans. You're Baroy, okay? And you look at the roster that's currently signed. Is there anyone in EU that's like a no-brainer for you to pick up? So, like, okay, they have only Punk as tank at the moment. Like, is that someone like kraandop? Could he fit in there? Or who else would fit that roster well?
Yeah, I'd take a kraandop.
Right?
Okay. That seems like the yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, especially because, kraandop, like we talked about, has that sort of flexibility, because before he was with EXO, he was with O1 and Twisted Minds. So he actually played Ball and Winston for those teams because they would run Pharmacy and they use things like a Ball or a Winston to open up space for either LBPD or Yazan to be able to work off of. So kraandop has probably the most amount of experience playing Winston in Contenders EMEA, except me before Jkaru. Jkaru might have a little bit more hours on Winston.
You can't say Winston without Jkaru.
Like, that is very true.
In EU, that's not fair. In a region with like not that many like dedicated Winston players, it really is. Yeah, like, and as far as like hero pool, right, with Punk and what you're looking at, like, kraandop just makes sense to go with them, and that's the one thing I want. Like, if these teams are gonna pick up 2 tanks, just make sure their tank lines go together. I think that's more important than any like amount of individual like crazy flexibility or skill or whatever. It's just as long as you have a cohesive plan, that is the most important. And their plan seems to be, okay, we have Punk, okay, we need a tank that can fill the main tank role, and both traditionally and likely on the hog. And kraandop's kind of shown us everything that you need in that. So yeah, that does seem like a no-brainer one to lean into.
What about the Florida Mayhem? They have 4 players, right? Like they have Checkmate, Someone, RuPaul, and Merit. So
Checkmate bet on tank.
Okay,
Checkmate Hog is the next edition. Trust me.
Right. So we need a support player, and I mean, we probably don't need a tank player with Someone. And that, yeah, I mean, it's your choice. Like, do you feel like there's anyone that could be a DPS that could slot into between Checkmate or Merit, or is there like, any support player that stands out? Maybe even 2 support players.
In EU specifically, Checkmate, Merit. I wouldn't hate Naga on a team like that. That's, again, like, just to provide that flexibility in the DPS line. Because, like, Merit, Checkmate, like, good at their particular heroes, but I definitely would want more from, like, a projectile DPS perspective and kind of the more flex things. And Naga really does bring that to the table. And then support line, who's there? What's the one that they have out right now?
RuPaul.
So Baps and Anna. I can see Slay, honestly, fitting in really nicely to that team. Just think of I want Slay in Overwatch League. Literally every single time you ask me a support-based question, I'm going to say Slay. He deserves it. He puts in so much effort. The fact that he can literally just really, like a chameleon, change his skin and really be able to hit the highest level of a hero and then do it with every single other support hero with so little time to get used to how they play. Because when we talk to Kiriko players, like every single time we did an interview with a Kiriko player, we would hear something different about how to use Suzu or how to use Rush or how to disengage with Rush. But it felt like Slay had just the best knowledge and understanding of how Kiriko's kit was used in the shortest amount of time. EXO were like the first team that really started using things like the Suzu on Death Blossoming Reapers because they understood that using that Suzu, committing that resource onto the Reaper meant that the ultimate found so much more value as opposed to holding on to it, losing the fight because your Death Blossom absolutely fluffs, and then you can't use Suzu because you're in your respawn point.
Yeah, I look at the flex roll as being important. Slay, Kanale is maybe a little too like this is the thing. Like I really back Kanale as somebody who's going to be big going into the next seasons of Contenders, but is just lacking the kind of proof of concept to do more. Right, played a lot of the more early on.
Old enough. Is he?
Is Kanale? I did not realize that was an issue.
Because he was.
Oh no, Kanale's 17. He's good.
Oh, there you go. So he is going to be okay now, but yeah, because he played for Munich in Open Div.
Experience, and we haven't seen enough of his hero pool. But like, look, his Moira is like gapping other Moiras, which is something that I can only say about like Fielder. Is my other shout out for like Moiras that just gap other Moiras, which seems like an impossibility, but again, very true. So
Reaper of supports.
I do really like Kanale. I think Kanale's got some growing to do, but very promising in the future. I gave a shout out to Zerion. I'm not sure how well he'd fit into the Mayhem system that they seem to have going.
I think his roster would overlap, unfortunately, with RuPaul.
Yeah, exactly.
A little bit too much, yeah.
I
can see him on other teams, but just not on Mayhem.
Exwrath, maybe, actually. But I think like Florida Mayhem are looking for a very traditional like flex DPS player, you know? Or flex support player, rather. So, yeah.
let me throw this one at you. You know, obviously Kevster is kind of.
Pardon me. Yeah. Never mind, man.
No, you're fine. Kevster's kind of the holding up the DPS line for the Gladiators, who every year feel like they're within striking distance of an Overwatch League title. If you had to choose one from the litany, it sounds like, that are graduating out of Europe, or hopefully graduating out of Europe, who would be your bet to pair with Kevster for the Glads?
See, that's the main one, because like we said, DPS lineups are the most saturated when it comes to top talent.
Pick a favorite. Gun to head. Fate of the universe on the line.
I mean, like Dora said, it's so hard to be able to like try and choose because of just the way that the meta played, right? Because Kevs obviously has like a very, 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 very strong hit scan. He's got a very good Genji. He has like a lot of really good hero pools. I could maybe see someone like Alexi finding value with him, just because like Alexi was one of those players that we were like a little bit on the fence about. And then he really came into his own in Run It Back, where on that Sojourn he just looked absolutely nuts. But again, it sort of comes back to like that overlap. I can see Kevster and Alexi working really well on someone like Circuit Royale, so that you can have like Sojourn and then you pair up with another hit scan, which would work out extremely well. But in terms of other maps, it's still like that issue of a lot of overlap, and which DPS you would really feel comfortable pairing Kevster up with, because we've seen like players who are good at Tracer, we've seen players who are good at Reaper and Sojourn, and that's about it.
No, I get it.
Yeah, and I mean, you've just got like a psycho hero pool.
Yeah, so there's always
he's hard
to
to
little
pair.
overlap.
Maybe LBBD actually is probably the only one who could bring something in the current Contenders EMEA region that Kevster can't, because LBBD can play both the Pharah and the Echo, and Pharah Ashe, or even Pharah Echo, not Ashe Echo, can be really strong in terms of just being able to set up a crossfire.
I think you go the Quartz UB route and say screw having the entire DPS pool covered. I think you lean into it, and I think you either go a player like a Naga, like an LBD, and have like kind of double flex and miss out on a couple of hit scan heroes and not really have like a dedicated sniper player, or you say screw it, we don't need Echo. What's that? Like, never heard of them, right? And then you just lock in like a Love or a Ken or somebody just like that has that sniper bone in their body. That would be
hybrid Kevster.
Yeah,
hybrid
exactly.
Kevster would be terrifying.
And then so you really like lean hard either way and then commit a decent bit of your team style to it, but you have two players that are as good and as pop off mechanically on those two roles. You might be able to get away with it. I think the most natural fit is something like a Naga that can kind of, you lean a little bit more towards the flex and then have like a good Hanzo, which is just like a default pick if you don't have a sniper player, right? But leaning the sniper out also sounds really fun, so I'm gonna throw that option out there as well.
Yeah. Okay. Let's play the the Man in Black game if you want, because of course we all have an idea who might be landing on the one destination of European players that's pretty, predestined, I suppose. In the London Spitfire, who would you have thought that team needed after the departures of the guys that they had last season, and like who would you have maybe entertained in order to move up to really a team that overperformed all expectations, right?
Okay. Because I there were also just, I know internally a lot of changes going on there, right?
Right.
And so the question is now, like, okay, do we think that people are going to continue to overperform? Do we want to continue to invest? Or do we have players that were all right that then improved and overperformed? How much better can they actually get? And how much, like, it's a team that was laid on so much volatility. And so the question is, how much do you actually want to maintain that, right? Because if you want to just take consistent players, I think there are consistent players out there. Obviously, we highlight the top ones, but there's players like Fi as well that would fit very well into that kind of European system that give you a traditional hit scan, that give you some really strong options in terms of just building a team off the back of. If you want to, for lack of a better word, give your team a backbone, right, to kind of build off of. I think that's one route that the London Spitfire could go if they want to continue with the EU route, but there are so many question marks of like, oh, okay, London Spitfire, like, do we just want a new team, or like, are we really trying to keep some pieces here? You know?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's like the same thing that Dora is like, are we going to see some players stick around from London? Because that then is going to influence significantly which players that they want to pick up, or whether or not they want to just do away with the entire team and pick up someone else. Like, I know there was a rumor going around for the longest time that Washington Justice were literally just going to cookie cut out Peps and put them into Overwatch League. Like, I could honestly see EXO getting cookie cut out and being put into London's roster. It helps as well that like a lot of them already have links towards the UK and also EU like esports as a whole. And if they want to keep themselves together and play with that same synergy that they've developed from A sides, B sides, and run it back, because this is a team that has been a year in the making. Like, you don't really want to disrupt all of that synergy you've already built in case everyone doesn't get picked up to Overwatch League and you're all there going like, okay, well, one of us made it to the big leagues, but what about the rest of us? Now we have to sort of manifest that same synergy in a very small capacity of time.
Wouldn't you still be? I mean, yes, there are definitely teams, especially like the O2s of the world, and I guess the ATs to a degree. We'll see how that works out eventually, but I'm a little hesitant, especially after what happened to the better part of Odyssey, right? In the Eternal, it's not like they hit but basically that was the best remaining team left in NA. They hit the Overwatch League. Didn't look so hot, right? What is the thing that you think is there that this wouldn't happen to XO, I guess?
I think it's just the adaptation. Like, this team is just the strongest at adaptation. We talked to a couple of teams like after the first week, because we saw teams really trying to stick with that Winston comp, and then some other teams just understood that they hadn't had enough time to be able to perfect it, and they decided to bend the knee and just run the Roadhog. EXO were one of those teams that literally, in the space of a week, because we were talking to some teams and being like, oh, who do you think is like the best at the Winston comp? Who are you most worried about running into with that Winston comp with? And every single answer we got was EXO. And everyone was going like, whether or not they just like looked at Korean VODs, whether or not they just practiced to absolute hell and back, they were able to, in the space of a week, get to grips of what it took a couple of Overwatch League teams absolute months to be able to nail down perfectly. So I think for EXO, it's not just the structure that they have in terms of what we see on the screen when they're playing, but it's also everything that's going on behind the curtain. The entire roster that this team has, both in terms of analysts, coaches, all of them are absolutely stacked. So if you just take every single one of those people and post them into Overwatch League and you don't change anything, I think they're going to be doing pretty reasonably, if not amazingly. But if London don't want to go that route, because as you've said, we've seen it fail. We've seen teams trying to go, okay, this is a really strong team. They had a really good performance in Contenders. Contenders isn't Overwatch League. A couple of Overwatch League players may still be in Contenders, but it's not like you're going up against Overwatch League teams who have those resources, who have the coaching, who have the analysts, who are able to literally give you all of those analysts of like, this is what this team does amazingly. This is how we're going to be able to counter it, because that's what EXO does. But that's what every single team in Overwatch League does at the same time. So for EXO, it would be them trying to fight against themselves. And that, I think, would be a great matchup, but I don't know how EXO would look on the other side of it.
I mean, I think that's like still pretty high praise. Like the fact that, you can still kind of at least pair them off at the baseline of owl talent, where it's like, okay, at the very least, like, you still have like those attributes of adaptability, and God forbid there is a meta shift, like you should still be able to adapt to it. Like, that's saying a lot.
So I'm gonna sit here and like not cope. I think this team would likely get the same treatment as like an Odyssey if they entered the Overwatch League. I think like it's weird. On one hand, like they definitely like when you have a team like that, there's always a chance they find success. But I have my questions of like whether it'd be like the super success you expect. Like you put this team in against a proper, and they're gonna like have a couple like Sims question marks above their head, right? Like it's just going to happen. And so I think with a team like this, each of their individual pieces is extremely strong and extremely consistent in their role. And these are players to me that are like, you could almost slot in anywhere as long as like I said, you're playing kraandop and filling out that main tank hero pool correctly, and same goes with yes. As long as you're like putting them into the correct team, they could slot in almost anywhere and give you like, say like, okay, our team's good. We're looking at maybe picking up like a new support player. We need a tank player to come and fill our like hog / off tank role. Like KSA is going to give you like a 15 to 20% improvement over whoever was underperforming for you last season, and that's like a guarantee. Like it's so consistent for them, and so I think this is a team that is definitely more than the sum of its parts, but is it more than the sum of its parts enough to compete with the absolute best in the Overwatch League? No. And I think you'd be a little jaded to
Yeah.
say
I mean,
that.
I don't think they would be able to compete with like the best of the best, but I still think they'd be able to give some of the middling teams a good run for their money.
Yeah, like exactly, like they, like they'll definitely like I think they'll do well guaranteed, and I think that they have potential to be really good, especially if you give them like coaching resources and stuff like that. But in their current state as individuals, I think they are really, really, really good pickups for the teams that want them, which would make them harder to pick up as a roster.
You know what it sounds like? It sounds like they would be a great academy team, or maybe a partnership team, or maybe a collegiate team. So all I'm saying, I'm just gonna leave that on the table.
Just give them all scholarships. All of them
scholarships. Hey, people could use some a bachelor's in marketing. You want to go into communications. Like, hey, there's
yeah. Makes you wish we had things like two-way players right now, but I don't think that opportunity's there for them. Yeah. Unfortunately, but yeah, they're all definitely worthy of making that, but I see them as like individual pickups that are going to give you that 15 to 20% improvement on a given role. That's like just guaranteed money. Like that is a solid pickup, and nobody's going to complain about it ever. If you need an improvement on a role, take any one of these guys.
That's actually the most important part, because I remember talking to Hydron, and he's like, and I remember like that was prior to last year's Overwatch League, and we talked about like British Hurricane and their lack of success in the Overwatch League. Of course, like in hindsight, it's probably also a little bit of the ping issue, not just a little bit, but a lot. And then them playing against AT, and like the reason Hydron was very bullish on AT doing very well, and even the individual pieces, was like British Hurricane had synergy and were good because they played good with each other. We were cracked while trolling the shit out of each other because we were individually just like above bar, right? And I think to a large degree that held true during their tenure in the Overwatch League on individual teams, where these guys could definitely hang in from a mechanics point of view with everyone else. So whenever a team succeeds by virtue of them having grown together, I'm now getting a little bit concerned, unless you get picked up for everything. But then you're also like, what is your vector of improvement? Your hand-eye coordination is not going to magically improve. And yes, maybe your synergistic advantages can further develop as you practice against the best teams in the world. Not great, historic precedent of that happening, right? Like it's probably like either you hit the market and you're instantly like the best team around, like Vancouver Titans in season 2, or like I guess there were no full rosters after that, or you're probably never going to make it to even respectability.
Can we meet in the middle with like a core of 4? Like maybe not the whole team.
Oh, here we go.
We take like the heart of it and we just plug it into like a roster.
Does that sound even worse? I don't know if I think that sounds. I don't know. There's not much precedent for it, but
it's dead.
I'll take like 2 players if you want to.
Yeah, I was gonna say take 2 by 2.
Yeah. Or like a good support line. I'm here for it, but like a core. I feel like you got to commit at that point, and then like maybe take a team of like 6 or 5, and then bolster it with another player that you see kind of fills a gap.
Okay.
I think that can be good, but I mean, again, circling back around to EXO in general, I think it almost puts it too lightly to put it how I'm putting it with like the whole 15 to 20% improvement thing. But like these are for the top teams that are looking to like change 1 player, change 2 players over the course of the offseason. These are the players you're picking from. And that's, I think, that speaks very highly of them, because they do have a lot of team synergy, and these are players that are very experienced as well, so they slot in easily. Like they're just ideal owl pickups, to be honest. Like, yeah, they should be easy to work with.
Yeah, I think the problem that I see for EXO though is that because when we saw them like at their strongest, which is at run it back, right? Their meta was reflected by Overwatch League teams. So kraandop being like that Winston specialist is going to have to go against other Winston specialists already in Overwatch League. The same can be said for players like Calyx, because Calyx is obviously one of the best Lucios in the EU region, but when I was looking at like London in specifics, London already have Admiral Raptor. So would you take Raptor out and put Calyx in, or would you keep Raptor and hope that if you pick someone up like KSA, that Roadhog Lucio synergy is going to be able to be built up, because it is just a matter of building up that synergy, having that Roadhog get to go aggressive with the Lucio speed boost, find that first pick, and win the fight.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, it's also really hard sell for people like Calyx to easily make it back. There's unfortunately this reputation of just being kind of washed and, you know, getting it. There is definitely like a certain bias in terms of
against players doing the gulag.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
I feel that. And like the longer you're there, the harder it is. But on the other hand, you know what's harder than all of that? Finding 6 visas.
Yeah.
5 visas now. Thank you very much.
Who's getting cut, Mox?
Yeah.
Tain't easy. Was there anybody else that you guys didn't feel like you shined a light on as we kind of wrap up? Any other names you want to like just spotlight? Lightning round.
Choose got absolutely shafted by the meta. Tough time out there. Ilisu kind of had the same thing happen. Exarath and Dala, I think, are on the improvement train. I hope to see more of them.
Okay.
And yeah, the DPS line is just all correct. So all of the DPS from like the top 7 teams,
I'm gonna say
definitely
Chai.
could all make it. Like
Yeah, like not
if
from.
they just have good trials, like they could all do it.
Yeah, like not from like a player's perspective. I think we've touched on a lot of players, but honestly, Chai for me for Raspberry Races, like this was a team that, speaking of like adaptation and really being able to sort of engineer specific strategies so that you have a very much team identity, even if you're playing the same meta as everyone else. Like Raspberry Races were one of those that came up with some really, really good rotations and positions in terms of like each specific map would just feel so uniquely theirs. When they would have like Watchpoint Gibraltar, they had this really good rotation on A, where they would move up through stairs, even when they were attacking, to be able to bite into the backsides of the defenders, taking away like that scrap over high ground, making it a lot easier for you to have your full 5 players before the fight started, because you don't get picked up or sniped off by like a Sojourn, and Chai was a large part of that identity that Raspberry Races were able to form, but they had really smart strategies. Unfortunately, not a lot of success in terms of implementing them sometimes, but when they worked amazingly. And he already is like one of those names that's known for all of the way that he did with teams like British Hurricane. I could definitely see him being potentially picked up.
Okay.
I think that's all the shots. I think we've talked about every single player in EU. They were right to warn you about, like, if we could go in depth about every player, we would. But the brunt of talent in EU is so hard to like chip away at one at a time that, like, yeah, in an ideal world, if we're just highlighting like people who are just obscenely good at Overwatch and can like 1v1 owl players on ladder, like we'd be here all day. So it's really hard to pick and choose.
The one thing, okay, here's my omega pessimistic point of view, is like the fact that nobody actually stands out is like the proper of the EU region concerns me a little bit.
Again,
yeah, we don't have a trait.
Sojourn might have made that really hard, to be fair.
Yeah.
Like, because even like I think Proper was a hero for being able to stand out amongst Sojourns, amongst a litany of very good Sojourns. And I think there are players who definitely shine in terms of like their ability just mechanically, right? Hybrid, Shockwave definitely come to mind. That are definitely getting more out. But like, I think the fact here is that the same as the Overwatch League, and I think we're kind of like looking back with rose-tinted glasses, like Proper was insane, but that doesn't mean that there weren't Sojourns that were also 4King his team at the same time. And the same things here. It's like, okay, yeah, like Hybrid and Shockwave are like 4King other teams maybe a little bit more consistently, and like it. But every Sojourn was 4King one another's teams at some point in time. It was just a matter of when, and so that's why it's so hard to stand out right now.
Sure.
And I think it was true in the Overwatch League, but there was already just a heavy light being shined on Proper prior to then. That when you did see that more consistent and pop off happen, it was really, really highlighted. So yeah, that's not to say Proper's bad, but I think he was like the exception, not the rule. I think to do that in any region or Overwatch League on Sojourn, no less, where it's so easy to look just absurd if you're good, it is just beyond difficult. So that's seems like an unfair bar with the 3 metas that we've been given through AB and Ryback.
I agree. The problem is, from a marketing point of view, if nobody stands out, there's complete apathy from an audience point of view for everyone, right? Like, there is no fairness in highlighting players, if that makes sense. Like, you shouldn't lie, of course, and if there's a lot of people on the same level, then that's probably just what you got to deal with that in the moment. And highlighting anyone over anyone else would be wrong there. But like, from what audiences latch onto, if you have like this guy on this team, this guy on that team, right? Like for Korea, let's say, like Joe got into Alpha Yi. Like, people were very high on the Prita. Like, there were guys just got the MVPs several seasons in a row, right? These are the narratives that the audience can hook into. And when it's more, ironically, everyone wants a highly competitive season where everyone can beat everyone until that happens, and then nobody really remembers those high points from them.
I think that, again, I'm just gonna like draw my problems back to Sojourn. Maybe I need to talk to a therapist.
Right.
But
No, it's true.
Like, it's like when everyone's special, nobody is kind of thing. Like, everyone's popping off, so it makes it hard to see who's popping off more. Like, that is a much harder metric to actually gather. I do think Flex DPS, there is actually just a crazy amount of individuality coming out. I mean, Psycho and Naga were both incredible for their own reasons, but Naga was a player, especially towards the end of the bracket, that I latched onto in terms of his Reaper play. So for me, like, that is, as far as like standouts go, in terms of finding an individual playstyle and being better at the given meta at the same time, I think Naga was definitely that for me.
Maimone was that for me, 100%. Like, Maimone, just when you could like see him when he was on the tracer, like, you knew it was Maimone playing. He had that sort of like identity, and sort of to cycle back as well to the whole thing of like, if everyone's great at Sojourn, no one's amazing at Sojourn. I'm gonna throw a wrench in that argument because door tree. Tree for NA, like, we literally coined a term to point out how good the guy was at Sojourn. I think, again, it just sort of cycles back to the fact that EU is extremely oversaturated in terms of that DPS role.
Does he look as head and shoulders above the competition? And I think the answer to that is no.
Really?
Like, he'd definitely be good. He'd definitely be good. He'd be one of the best ones here. But would he be head and shoulders above like he is in NA? No. Like,
and look.
No.
Once again, like, once again, like, here in my internal monologue, the soccer PFP and the Redditor are currently screaming for me to say, well, all those guys that are like currently popping off were literally not good enough to cut it at all. Even the worst team in the Overwatch League, right? Naga and Shockwave. So, like, if I'm not a person that follows EU Contenders, now I enter that situation in the bias of going like, wait, those are your best guys? Okay, right?
Yeah, Overwatch 2 changed a lot, to be fair.
Right.
Like, again, the big reason why, like, I think Shockwave and Psycho definitely, like, there's a lot of stuff with them leaving the Overwatch League. That is, tangential. But like, they definitely only got better with Overwatch 2. And same goes for just like, players out there. BenBest, who is traditionally thought of as that like Reinhardt player, right? Has expanded to become like a hyperflex, and the best one that we probably have in Contenders right now, or at least as far as EU and NA goes. So people's identities, their play styles, and their abilities have all changed massively with the shift in game.
Oh, you would peg BenBest over Gig?
Over Gig? I would definitely, I would think, want a...
Keep in mind, this might cause a fist fight with Kenobi. I'm just saying.
That's a really hard one. They're like very similar in a lot of ways. I think BenBest is more flexible, just that little bit. Like when you're already talking about players that are insanely flexible, I think BenBest is just that little bit more flexible. But Gig is gonna give you more value on the tanks that he specializes in. But is still a pretty flexible tank player, actually. Again, another main tank player who is not thought to be flexible has kind of become that over time. And I think he flexes kind of that sweet spot amount where he can play just enough where you have a second tank that can kind of specialize as well, and he doesn't have to cover as many bases as like another normal flex tank would. Whereas BenBest is like, right now it's all flex, and then he's got like just that slight specialization towards the main tank heroes. So that's a really hard one. I think those two are a great comparison and kind of through line to one another from region to region.
Yeah,
I mean, I would say it would be fair, and then Gig would go into Orisa, and Orisa he would just dumpster. Like Gig probably has one of the best.
What was the TV show where they would put like hypothetical battles between
Deadliest Warrior?
Deadliest Warrior? Yeah, we're like simulating BenBest versus Gig and Deadliest Warrior.
Would a Spartan like, fight a Green Beret?
And then BenBest would go over to Doomfist, and Gig would play Orisa, and then he has no answer. And then you watch the simulation go down.
He would win a million times.
Honestly, like Gig has just the best Orisa in Contenders level. I would say between both NA and EMEA, Gig is the best Orisa player. And this is a hill that I will die on, and I'm pretty sure Kenobi will be side by side, 6 feet under with me in that argument. Like, his Orisa is insane.
All right, Yiska, final thoughts before we wrap up 277.
Yeah, no, I think generally speaking, it just makes sense given recent a lack of recent promotions of EU players that there just has to necessarily be a lot of gems there. I think the argument of that Overwatch 2 has changed a lot about the game and how these players, how their skill set fits into that role, into that new game. That definitely rings true to me. I always feel like Shockwave's career is maybe the most tragic of Overwatch careers, just in the length of how hard he got screwed over at every single corner. Like, in terms of like the different teams that he was on, and how the pandemic played into that. So I always want to have players like that get the third chance by now. But yeah, generally speaking, I'm looking forward to hopefully whoever gets promoted also really provide a proof of concept in order to tell general managers there's something there and worth looking at also in future seasons.
True. All right. I want to, thank both of you, both Moxie and Dor, for joining the show and educating us on all there is to know about Contenders Europe. But I want to give the final last bit of the show to the both of you to let us know what you guys are up to and what people can look out for. So Moxie, what's happening on your docket agenda for
Overwatch related or anything?
Whatever's going on.
Okay, so we just wrapped Naraka Blade Points World Championship, which was in December, and we're heading into 2023 looking to the next Pro League season. Hopefully we're going to have Contenders EMEA continuing as well. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, to get in on some of the World Cup action and maybe represent UK in some of the qualifying events continuing, and I'm sure Dora is going to be the same in terms of trying to stick around World Cup for America.
Yeah, sounds likely. Just more Overwatch, more Contenders stuff likely. One thing I do want to shout out is I'm planning on doing what I did last season. I got a whole bunch of community power rankings once all the rosters were released and kind of averaged them out into what was maybe one of the most beautiful pieces of data that I've managed to shit out in my entire life. And so I really wanted to do that again. So follow my Twitter, whatever. I'll put a tweet out there. Please submit your power rankings to me, and I will absolutely tell you how wrong you are at the end of the season, because holy God, were people wrong this season. It was not like I had a big sample size too. I think I had like close to 300 submissions, and it was a disaster. You guys could not have been more wrong. So I'm
just
excited
do
to
a
see
video shaming
how
them.
bad it gets this time.
And these power rankings were about Contenders, right? Like not Owl?
Or? No, that was for Overwatch League.
Oh, okay. We wouldn't know anything about wrong power rankings about Overwatch League, would we, Joe?
I mean, you can speak for yourself. I was pretty wrong. But if that's it, and please do support Tier 2. Go watch some Contenders. Obviously, this is the end of Contenders month, but I'm sure you'll be seeing some of their faces on the show more often than not. Go support Tier 2. Go follow all of both these two, both Moxie and Door.
One more shout out.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you happen to be like top 500 and playing quick play at 2 a.m., say hi. It's a slim group, and I know them well.
Some East Coast ranked vibes, apparently.
Yeah, exactly, bro.
Alrighty, that is going to be episode 277 for Tactical Crouch. Enjoy the new year. Stay safe. And we'll see you when the season starts. Well, I mean, we'll see you next week, but whatever. 277.
Well done. Peace.